Sooner or later, we all need to rip out stitches. It's just a process of sewing. I am an advocate of a tapered sewing awl. They make these for use by tailors and dressmakers. And when you rip out a stitch with a sewing awl, you just pick up the stitch with the awl and pull, and you'll break that stitch sometimes you'll pull out a good stretch of stitch. That leaves a continuous thread that's not broken. You can take that thread and just pull and pull right out through the stitches like you would with a basting thread, basting stitch. I sew a stitch line pretty much right down the middle of the floor. Of a folded hem, I like to stitch right down the inside fold. As close as I can. And then go back and take a decorative stitch down the outside fold. So you've got a nice set of stitches right along that nice finished edge. Outside of a rolled hem, a flat felled seam is one of the most common seams in gear making. A flat felled seam, you take two layers of fabric, put them together so the wrong sides are together, set the edges up evenly. Now there are directions where you offset the edges. I like to set the edges up evenly. Have a hem distance, hem allowance of about 3/4 of an inch. And so your original seam. The flat felled seam can be a very bulky seam, so it is most common to trim off part of the seam allowance. This is where it can get a little bit tricky. You need to look at your seam from the right sides of the fabric and decide where you want the seam to lay. You want, especially if it's on a tarp, for example, you want the fabric to lay so that the water slides down over the seam and does not get pooled where the seam is. So you're going to want to trim off that layer of fabric which belongs to the downhill or the downwater side. Trim the fabric off close to the stitching. Then you're going to fold that seam over so that it covers the area that you just trimmed. I like to line up that first layer of stitching, first row of stitching, right along the side, right along the fold. Then the next row of stitching goes on the inside of that fold, as close to the edge as possible. This is where the flat felt seam can get a little confusing. You open up the fabric, set the seam so that it folds across the seam that you just sewed, and sew down right along the folded edge. Check your fabric to make sure that your folds are on the right place, and then stitch right along that loose end, that loose fold of the fabric. It starts with having the fabric with the wrong sides together. The French seam is used as a finishing seam and is really quite attractive once it's done. Then the fabric is turned so the right sides are together. The inside, what will be the inside, is showing, and the seam is adjusted, and then it is sewn once more in such a way as to capture that whole seam allowance inside the channel that's made. The piece is turned inside out, so the seam is clean on the outside and has that little channel on the inside, keeping everything from raveling out. It's a very handy seam